Hello, my name is Taya Graham, and welcome to the Police Accountability Report. As I always make clear, this show has a single purpose: holding the politically powerful institution of policing accountable. But how does that work, and why do we do it week after week? Well, I think in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic, it should be clear. America is over-policed, over-punished, and over-incarcerated. And now that our past emphasis on all these aforementioned processes is being exposed for what it is, now that we are facing an existential crisis that we are unprepared for, it is more crucial than ever to hold the politicians and their greed-infused masters accountable for the carceral state they created. Because now, more than ever, we face the challenges that are directly related to questionable policy decisions that have brought us to the brink of catastrophe. And that will be the theme of this show. But first, if you have evidence of police misconduct, please email the evidence privately to us at par@therealnews.com or at eyesonpolice@gmail.com or message me at eyesonpolice on Twitter. And please like, share, and comment on our video. You know I read your comments and appreciate them. Now, one aspect of the coronavirus pandemic that has received some attention, but perhaps is not fully understood, is the role testing plays in suppressing the scope of it. While the U.S. has failed to even test patients already showing signs of the disease, countries like South Korea and cities such as Singapore, they have been vigilant. There, testing has been abundant and compulsive. And there, as you can see by the graph I'm now showing you, the virus has been contained without the massive disruption of daily life we've experienced here. Now, I'm sure you're asking, why would I bring up testing for a virus on a show about policing? You're probably wondering, what's the connection between fighting a virus and law enforcement? Well, it's really to prove a point. An important point about America's obsession with punishment and policing, and how the flawed decision to sink decades of resources into it is being exposed for what it is: bad policy. And to make this point, I'm going to refer to America's multi-billion-dollar decision that has fueled our lack of preparedness, and contrast to what might have been if this country had not been so obsessed with it. Because while we can't test people with a deadly virus that has literally put the entire US economy on the brink of disaster, for decades, as we waged a war on drugs, we built a testing surveillance state that is unrivaled in the history of human civilization. Decades of low-level possession drug arrests led to millions of people incarcerated, millions of years of unjust sentences that were accompanied by, you guessed it, testing. And our addiction to incarceration spawned an even more expansive post-incarceration surveillance state, because almost all the people who were sent to jail or prison end up entangled in the tendrils of a system that extends well beyond their release from a cell. According to the Prison Policy Initiative, in addition to the 2.3 million people housed in U.S. prisons and jails, a staggering 4.5 million people are in some sort of community monitoring, either parole or probation, and almost all those people have to submit to weekly or monthly drug tests. Just scan the internet and you'll see dozens of websites that offer testing for a wide array of drugs, and almost endless list of options if you want to know if someone smoked a joint or had a drink. And so why do I bring this up? Because it's a sign of how utterly broken our American political system is, that we spent decades monitoring and caging people, but cannot muster the collective will to test people and protect ourselves from a deadly virus, that we constructed an infrastructure of command and control to battle our penchant to alter the mind, but we cannot summon the resources to ensure our common survival. It's a disturbing misalignment of social resources, a decision to wage war on our own people while the real enemy lurked around us. For more on this, I want to go to my reporting partner, Janis, who's in the field. Stephen, tell me where you are and why it's significant.
Right, Taya. Thanks for having me on. I'm standing outside of Baltimore's central booking facility. It's where they process 40,000 prisoners a year, and there are people locked inside right now that people are saying should not be there. Low-level offenders, people who did not commit violent crimes, who are basically sitting in a virtual death sentence because they can't do social distancing inside a prison. But so far, Maryland authorities have refused to release release people. And so it's caused controversy.
Now, Stephen, we spoke to state correction authorities. Are they still conducting drug tests for probation and parole?
Taya, that is a great question. We asked them today, and yes, they are still making people report to probation and parole officers across the state. What that means is that people are still getting drug tested. People are still having to go and do piss tests. People are still having to go into the probation and parole centers across the state and risk getting the virus, which, is going to be a huge vector. So despite the fact that the state is facing a critical crisis, people are still having to interact with the probation and parole. And what it points out to is something very important that you pointed out to. There are more people under the supervision of probation and parole than there are people in prison. Millions more. And all these people are risking their lives every day just to get a drug test for taking marijuana or something, whereas you can't get a drug test for the coronavirus. So it's a big issue.
Stephen, one other question. We have some sanity in Baltimore's arrest machine. The state's attorney, Marilyn Mosby, made an announcement yesterday. What did she say?
Right, Taya, this is a big deal. State's Attorney Marilyn Mosby is a progressive prosecutor who has taken a lead on many progressive criminal justice policies. Said she has told her prosecutorial staff to drop charges anyone charged with prostitution, low-level crimes, drug possession, drug dealing, and to just let them go. And it was met with a lot of approval. And this is not unusual for Marilyn Mosby. She's been very progressive and very forward, and she is taking the lead on this while state leaders have, sort of dragged their heels. Mosby has just stepped forward and pretty much said, we're going to let these people out. There's no point in prosecuting them now. And the court system shut down anyway, so you couldn't prosecute them.
But to discuss in more detail America's draconian penal system in the light of the coronavirus epidemic, I'm joined by Kimberly Haven. Kimberly Haven is a longtime advocate for the rights of people who are incarcerated, and specifically women. She's a member of Reproductive Rights Inside. Kimberly, thank you for joining us. So, Kimberly, first off, as a person who's been working to reform our carceral state, in the light of the current crisis, does it seem even more tragic that we've invested so much money in public punishment and not in public health?
Absolutely. And now that debt is coming to be paid, and it is just a matter of time before the footprint of this virus is felt behind the fence across the country and back out in our communities. And so, this is our arrogance, this is our complacency, this our belief that a crisis like what we're going through in this country right now can't happen. And it shows how woefully unprepared we are just in general, but with a population that we don't think about, it is even more troubling, and it is even more dire that we act now.
Kimberly, you have said publicly the state of Maryland should release anyone they can at this point. Why do you think that's necessary and that it should be a national policy?
It is absolutely necessary. And it is becoming a national policy. I have been talking on a daily basis to my colleagues across the country who are making the same asks of their states. Our prisons are incubators. And so when there's no social distancing in prison. You can't control who you're in a room with. You cannot control your access to medical care. You have no control over the conditions that you live in. You have staff that goes out into the community. They go back home and then they come back in, and there's no testing of all of that. And so to the extent that we can release people who have chronic care conditions. In Maryland, we have close to 8,000 people who the state has identified as having chronic care conditions, and that also includes medically vulnerable. If you are pregnant, if you have a compromised immune system, you will actually be healthier in the community. So to the extent that we can suspend arresting people for low-level violations, for technical violations of parole and probation, so that we can stem the tide of people going in. We can release people who don't pose a threat, people over the age of 60 who have done an exorbitant amount of time. Again, we know that their potential for recidivating is much lower after age 45. We can safely release people, because the key to doing this behind the walls is going to be to reduce the number of people that we actually have incarcerated.
I think what you're saying here is that a prison sentence is, in some sense, a death sentence right now.
It is. And in fact, I was at a conference 2 weeks ago in New York, before everything kind of like blew up and we weren't allowed to travel anymore. And there's actually a campaign, it's death by incarceration. So people who are being given these long draconian sentences it is a life sentence. It is a death sentence for people that are going in with these chronic conditions and now being exposed to a pandemic that they cannot respond to. Is a death sentence. And that's not what our system of justice was set up to do. You break the law, there's a punishment, there's a sanction. You see that through. You don't go to prison to die.
And finally, what do you think can come from this? Is this an opportunity to finally put a dent in our carceral state and over-policing?
I think that this is a pivotal time. I think that we can actually show that we can release people safely, that there is not a threat to public safety. And I think that that will show that the way that we use incarceration is beyond punitive, and that it is outdated and antiquated, and that it is ripe for reform. I think that the other thing that this poses for us is an opportunity to realize that the people that we have in our care, custody, and control are not afterthoughts, and that they are a microcosm of what's happening in the greater community. And so this is a population that we need to absolutely make sure there's an emergency plan. We're canceling schools. Found out today I can no longer get my pedicure on Saturday. Not real happy about that. But when you're on the inside and you can't access laundry, you can't access social distancing, you can't access these very things, this prevents a pivotal time for us to be able to put in mechanisms to ensure that we can survive this, we can handle it when it comes up again, because let's not fool ourselves. This will come back again in some form or fashion. If we don't learn from this, we are doomed to absolutely repeat it. This is a perfect storm that is happening right now. What we do to get us on the other side of it is what's going to determine how we move forward, how we function as a country, how we survive as a people.
Let's be clear. Kimberly's point is the point. I mean, how foolish does the war on drugs look in light of a health crisis where we don't have face masks and protective gear for our medical staff? How silly does our prison construction binge look when we're sending a boat to house people suffering from the coronavirus because of a shortage of hospital beds? In fact, just today, the Centers for Disease Control told American doctors and nurses on the front line of this crisis that they would have to rely upon homemade masks or bandanas. But let me ask you this. Have you ever heard of a shortage of handcuffs or Kevlar or military equipment for SWAT teams? Ever? I mean, in any given year, police make 1.5 million drug arrests. Why is it the government can't test a couple thousand people who may be infected and don't know it and may be making others sick? If we can detain, prosecute, house, and monitor for years millions of people, why can't we beat back an invisible virus, which, just a note, a totalitarian regime known as China has managed to contain? The point is that what this calamity exposes is just how wrong-headed our criminal justice policy is, just how much of a mistake it has been for decades to put more cops on the streets and lock people up while critical public health infrastructure was allowed to languish. I mean, since the Trump administration took office, they ramped up distribution of military equipment to local police, filled up private prisons, and launched a myriad of useless investigations. At the same time, they shuttered the Office of Pandemic Preparation in 2018. Do you see my point? This country has no problem detaining, monitoring, and hurting people for nebulous predictions and wholly human behaviors. But when it comes to making us safe and healthy, that's a different story. So as dark and ominous as this crisis seems right now, let's not miss the opportunity to call attention to this civic deficit. Let's not allow fear to prevent us from demanding change. Because as horrible as the coronavirus pandemic is, as much as the crisis has risked both the lives and the livelihoods of people, we must demand the change that will prevent the same pattern of neglect and malfeasance to continue. This is a moment, however horrible, to ask the most difficult questions, to once and for all reveal the criminal justice industrial complex for what it truly is, a burden upon our minds and bodies that must at last be lifted. I want to thank my guest, Kimberly Haven of Reproductive Justice Inside, for her expert insights and for talking with us today.
Listen, I appreciate everything that you're doing to keep this story going, to get people engaged in this, and to get them to understand a population and a constituency that nobody thinks about.
And I want to thank reporter Stephen Janis for going out in the field to get us the news and for his invaluable reporting and writing.
Taya, thanks so much for having me. We'll keep reporting here from the field.
And of course, I have to thank friend of the show, Noli D. Hi, Noli. And I want you watching to know that if you have evidence of police misconduct or brutality, please share it with us and we might be able to investigate. Please reach out to us. You can email us your tips privately at par@therealnews.com or at eyesonpolice@gmail.com and share your evidence of police misconduct. You can also message us at Police Accountability Report on Facebook or Instagram or at Eyes on Police on Twitter. And of course, you can message me directly at Taya's Baltimore on Twitter or Facebook. And please like and comment. I do read your comments and appreciate them, and I do my best to get back to you as well. I'm your host, Taya Graham, and I want to thank you for joining me for this Police Accountability Report. Please be safe out there.